Hello everyone. So we are going to be covering chapter 5, where we consider how projects are identified and selected, and then how we manage their scope. So the key concepts that we will learn in this chapter is the understand the processes through which we identify and select projects. Also, we discuss project initiation process. After a project is selected, how do we go about initiating a project? And then lastly, we will discuss scope management processes. Portfolio management, which is basically the idea of selecting the right mix of projects, is extremely important in getting the greatest return on the investments that we are making on IT projects. Harrah's Casinos is an example of an organization that has effectively used IT projects in improving the return from their gaming operations over the years. The project selection or identification and selection process is one of the most critical processes, which determines a portfolio project, a mix of projects that best support the short and long-term needs of an organization. Organizations are typically given a set IT budget, and they need to decide on which projects they will invest their IT budget. This is very similar to our personal situations, where we need to decide where to invest based on short-term and long-term needs. And of course, based on those, we select a mix of investments that yield the highest return. For example, for our short-term needs, we may use savings or certificate of deposits, CDs. If our investment horizon is long-term, we may choose stocks or other equities. So for most individuals, really the best investment strategy is to have a mix of short and long-term investments, not just focus on either short-term or only on long-term. The first step is to identify the IT projects, the IT systems, and then we assess their feasibility and risks. You know, what kind of returns we are going to get, what kind of risks are associated with them, and based on those we compare alternative projects, alternative ways that we can do projects, and select a project based on our business objectives and the set of criteria that we come up. Those are the criteria that are important to us. There are a number of sources for identification of IT systems. The business or technology strategy can be a source, and for example, if a health organization decides that providing telehealth is a key strategic business and IT strategy, then that overall strategy identifies the IT projects that would be needed for the health organization to move to provide a wide array of telehealth services. Legal or regulatory requirements may be the source of other IT projects, um, and those are to basically the projects that would bring the organization in line with the regulations, or possibly maybe take advantage of the regulations that are put in place. As an example, a number of years ago, a law was passed which offered a big incentive to the health organizations for adopting electronic health record systems. This caused many health organizations to implement EHR systems primarily to take advantage of that incentive rather than focusing on how the EHR system can help make the organization more effective and more efficient. Because of lack of that focus, the focus of bringing efficiency and effectiveness to the organization, many of these implementations of EHR systems failed, and over the last several years, many organizations are incurring additional costs to implement or to replace the original EHR system that was poorly implemented in the organization. Sometimes stakeholders ask for new capabilities that require a new or an improved IT system. For example, patients may prefer their prescriptions to be sent to the local pharmacy, and that need from that stakeholder group may require the addition of the pharmacy module in the EHR system that the practice uses. Sometimes there is a need to improve or modify a business process which will require changes in the IT systems. For example, many practices have modified their patients' check-in process during the pandemic. These business process changes may require some changes to be made to their practice management software. Different stakeholders have different foci when they identify IT projects. For example, typically senior executives identify IT projects that have strategic focus. When I was overseeing the technology for probation and pretrial services officers, the federal probation leadership decided to become an outcome-focused organization. For that, we needed a system to pool the statistics on many things such as recidivism, that's the rate of rearrest, or percent of employed from different systems, and bring them all into one system that we call decision support system. Developing a decision support system and making the many of these statistics available throughout the organization may sound simple, but is actually a quite challenging endeavor, and many organizations have failed to implement such systems because of some technical difficulties, but also cultural resistance to have that kind of transparency across the organization. A steering committee may have a different focus. When I became the CTO of US courts, I formed a technology steering group consisting of a number of executives responsible for technology for various parts of the court system. One of the major decisions that we made was to move from our own data center to the cloud because of the significant savings that the cloud offered and also increased security. This strategic move, this decision had or caused many IT projects to be formed because we needed to move all of our systems to a state that they are cloud ready. User departments are typically more focused on their operations and tactical needs. For example, a billing department may request an IT system to implement a new insurance requirement feature in the billing system. Senior IT managers are more focused on improving the integration and operations of IT systems. So they may require adoption of web services for communication across various applications instead of a variety of inefficient data exchange mechanisms that may exist among the organization's systems. Again, similar to our personal investment portfolios, we need a variety of projects in an organization that supports running and operation of the organization, as well as growing the organization and perhaps expanding its market and its reach, or the ones that transform the organization. We need a mix of these, and it would be a mistake for an organization to just focus on one of these areas rather than having a mix of these various type projects. We develop IT projects plan to support the strategic plan of the organization. So let's talk a little bit about that strategic plan. And really the purpose of a strategic plan is to move the organization from its current state to a future desired state. When I was in US court, we had a group responsible for facilitating the updates to our strategic plan. And as part of the senior executive staff, I participated in several workshops where we reviewed and updated the strategic plan. You see a copy of or a picture of the 2020 strategic plan for the judiciary, and you can actually access this on the internet. And if you do, you will see the mission statement of the judiciary. It's stated in there as along with many priorities that have been established as part of the strategic plan. As you notice, even though the judiciary is as part of the federal government, it strives to not only meet the national needs, but also meeting local courts' needs. And this was very much a part of the judiciary's culture and approach, that local courts, district courts, bankruptcy courts, appellate courts, they all have unique needs in different parts of the country, and we were responsible to make sure that those needs are identified and captured in our strategic planning process. Some organizations go through a value chain analysis. This basically entails looking at the set of inputs and the operations that you perform, which delivers the products and services of the organization. And then assigning a value to each step in the process. Of course, there are a number of support organizations such as HR, procurement, or IT that support the operation of the organization, and their value added need to be also assessed. When let's take a look at or think about a hospital. How would the value chain work? The hospital uses hospital facility, hospital equipment, and medication as input for their operations to provide healthcare services to its patients. The value chain analysis looks at the value added and the cost associated with each step. By going through this value chain analysis, you can identify the steps or processes that can most benefit from IT projects. So this would be another source to help you identify real good IT projects that can have a major impact in the organization. Parallel to and in support of the corporate strategic planning process, we establish what the future state of IT needs to be, and comparing that to the current state of IT, and going through that, then we can develop or identify the projects that need to be that are needed to move the organization from the current state to the future state. When we assess the current state of an organization, we need to consider the organizational units, organizational functions, the locations, the processes, and also the information systems that are in place. When I was with U.S. courts, we had 94 district courts, some 80 bankruptcy courts, 90 probation and pretrial services offices, and 12 appellate courts. Each of these units not only used the national information systems, but many had adopted additional systems to satisfy their local needs. So when we were planning the national IT plans, we had to consider the local IT landscape, and that was a critical element of our overall plan. Also, I would like to point out the fact that the importance of data and data entities is being realized by more and more organizations. In fact, at U.S. courts, we brought on board a chief data officer several years ago to establish a data governance through which we could establish the ownership and the authoritative source for various data entities in the organization. By establishing such ownership, then we move toward the state where data is captured once by the owner of the data and shared with others who need that data entity, rather than each system try to duplicate and recapture the same data. And of course, if you have that situation, which we did in a number of our systems, that causes a lot of inefficiencies and huge problem when you're trying to reconcile data across various systems. Furthermore, to better understand the current state of an organization when we are going through our strategic planning, we can further break down the organization by functions. This is called functional decomposition to understand various processes associated with each function. This slide shows you some of the typical functions that are identified through a functional decomposition process. Another very useful tool in understanding data entities is to map that through this matrix to business functions. So we basically see which business function is using the different data entity. Another step that needs to be taken with this matrix is to establish which function has the ownership of the data entry. Again, this is part of the work that a chief data officer establishes through a data governance board. And it's a difficult effort as well. I don't want to minimize the difficulty in identifying data owners, because there are a lot of political forces behind owning the different parts of the data in an organization. After going through all of our IT planning efforts, the results are captured in an IT plan that typically contains the organization's mission, objectives, strategy, and of course it would have the short-term and long-term needs identified in the plan. From that plan, then we can actually identify the long-term projects as well as short-term projects. For those on the short-term list, many organizations use a service request to initiate examining those projects, doing analysis, and further look at the project in terms of its feasibility. During the analysis, one of the things we look at is what are the benefits of the system, and these benefits could be in the form of cost savings, error reduction, or improved productivity. We also need to look at the one-time costs associated with the project. These would be things such as development, if we are developing a system, or procurement costs associated with software as well as hardware, user training, site preparation. These are all examples of one-time project costs that we need to consider. Another cost that gets into the analysis is recurring costs. We need to consider the ongoing costs such as maintenance costs, upgrades, supplies if we need those over time. So we bring the benefits, the one-time costs, the recurring costs together, and we can then do some financial analysis. For example, we can identify or calculate the net present value, which is the value of all benefits and costs brought to today's dollar. Or we can look at return on investment, ROI, very similar to the interest rate or the interest we get when we put our investment in a savings account. That rate that we get, the savings rate, is our return on investment. We can also conduct a break-even point analysis. This is when the benefits offsets all the costs up to that point on the project. Along with financial returns, we need to consider risks associated with projects. And that should be part of our analysis, very similar as we consider and analyze different investments for our personal needs. So as far as risk is concerned, obviously if it's a project that is dealing with familiar technology, that would be lower risk than the projects that we are getting into technologies that the organization is not very familiar with. Similarly, as you would expect, smaller projects have less risk than larger projects. So that's another element. Risk is another element that we need to consider in our analysis. So pooling all of the information that we have together, financial as well as non-financial aspects of the project, then we can assign a weighting factor for each of these factors. And this is basically indicating the importance of each of those factors from the organization's perspective. Having that in place, then we can actually rank a number of alternative ways of achieving the project and rank them in each of those areas, and having the weighting factor for each of those scores, then we can actually rate each alternative in terms of which alternative satisfies our criteria the best. So after we analyze various alternatives, we may select one of the alternatives. That's when we accept the alternative. We can also reject all of the alternatives, and if they don't really make sense for the organization. We may also decide to delay the project if maybe some issues need to be resolved, maybe some technologies need to be investigated, or we can refocus the project if we see that there are parts of it that are not as beneficial. Maybe we drop those pieces and maybe refocus some of the objectives of the project in new areas. Selecting the right project is typically one of the most important activity in managing projects. To highlight this point, let me share with you a chart that I've developed over the years, where the vertical axis or y-axis shows the right projects versus those that are wrong projects. By that I mean the right projects have great business case and they have a strong business sponsor, versus on the x-axis, let's look at how well project management is done, meaning that going from left, poor project management, to excellent project management. So when you have this, where do we want our projects to be? Clearly, the ideal quadrant is the top right quadrant. This is where we have chosen the right projects with strong business case, as well as we are executing these projects with excellence. Probably as obvious is that opposite to that is the lower left quadrant, which would be the worst projects. These are the where we have wrong projects and we manage them poorly. The lower right, these are the projects that are poor in terms of, or they're wrong projects, and but we manage them with excellence. But these projects cannot produce good business results anyway. And finally, the top left quadrant are those projects that had strong business case. We poorly manage them. In most cases, they may have okay business results because they were so strong in their business outcomes. So this basically, my point in this chart is that it is very critical that you stay on above the horizontal line in this chart, meaning that selecting the right project is the most important first step in initiating IT projects. And of course, after you have done that, then excellent project management will augment the performance of the project and deliver even better results than it would otherwise. After the initial analysis, if the project is selected and it's approved to move forward, then the project goes through the initiation phase. The initiation phase involves developing the project charter, developing project management plans, and establishing the information systems that we will be using for the project. So let's take a quick look at each of these. This is a project charter, an example of project charter, and you see that things such as project overview, project objectives, key assumptions, roles and responsibilities for key stakeholders, all of those are captured in this document, the project charter. The project management plans will establish the key baseline of scope, schedule, and cost. They also lay out for managing scope, requirements, schedule, cost, quality, resources, risk, procurement, and stakeholders. By the way, you recall that we have already discussed stakeholders management in the previous chapters. We also need to establish which information system we will be using for managing projects. This is an example of SharePoint, how it's used for managing project documents. Scope management is one of key project management processes. It involves collecting requirements, defining scope, breaking down the scope into work breakdown structure, WBS, validating the scope, controlling it during the execution. Fundamentally, scope should clearly establish what is included in the scope of the project, and as importantly, what is not included in the scope. So why is scope management so important? Why is it that we are talking about it as the first management process that in project management discussion. Well, this scope establishes expectations for the project among stakeholders. So it's important to establish a clear and realistic expectation. Keep in mind that scope is one of the triple constraints, along with cost and schedule, that impact the quality of the project. If we don't manage scope, it is very possible, and it often scope expands. That is what's called scope creep. Generally speaking, we need to avoid or defer changes to scope because it's proven that it is much more effective to finish a project and then add the changes later rather than try to make the changes along the way, unless those changes are critical for achieving the business objective of the project. One of the key deliverables from scope management activities is development of scope statement. This is a statement that outlines the problem or the opportunity that the project is addressing, its objectives, its descriptions, the benefits, and as well as its deliverables. After the scope is finalized, all requested changes to scope need to be reviewed, assessed, and decided on. And as part of the analysis of each request, we need to assess the impact of cost and schedule, and that information in terms of the impact need to be in place before approval of the change. And if the change is approved, then of course we need to update our baseline cost and schedule to reflect that change. This essentially is the tool we use to control the scope in scope management process. So this concludes my chapter 4 lecture. Thank you, everyone.